Good morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told, out of OSA Radio. So today, we need to take a look at the continued history of the Pokemon trading card game. We have made it all the way to EX Deoxys, the set which actually completed Generation 3 of the Pokemon trading card game, or I suppose Generation 3 of the video game in the trading card game, by bringing in Deoxys. Now, it was released in Japan on July the 1st, 2004. There was actually a very big gap before it was released in English on Valentine's Day 2005. Now, the reason for this is the same as we looked at with EX Team Rocket Returns last week, when we talked about the fact that actually there was a much smaller gap than usual. There was a 1 month gap for that set. And the reason is there was the film Destiny Deoxys, and Pokemon wanted to coincide the release of this set based around Deoxys with the movie about Deoxys. So that's why EX Team Rocket Returns had a tiny gap, and this actually had a much, much larger gap. It was also they could just do the tie-in with the movie. And I'm not entirely sure any of us can be particularly upset about that. That kind of seems like it makes sense. Now, it did finally bring Deoxys into the Pokemon trading card game, and we do actually see that there were 3 regular Deoxys and 3 Deoxys EX all in the set. It brought in Deoxys, but it really brought in Deoxys. I mean, to be fair, they called the set EX Deoxys. If it wasn't really Deoxys focused, that would be, somewhat of a misstep on their part. And obviously, Deoxys has multiple forms: normal, attack, defense, and speed, so it makes sense that we would get multiple Deoxys in the set. Now, we will take a quick look at them because I do think they are relevant. They all had the Pokepower form change. Once during your turn, you may search your deck for another Deoxys and switch it with Deoxys, though any cards attached to it, damage counters, special conditions, etc. are now on that new Pokemon. You can only do one each turn, but that's pretty gosh darn cool. So then you've got the one that does 40 damage for 2 energy, and if Deoxys doesn't have the same amount of energy on as a defending Pokemon, it only does 20. The one that for 3 energy does 10 damage plus 10 more for each energy attached to all of your opponent's Pokemon, good against decks that like to accelerate lots of energy. And the one that for 2 energy does 20 damage, but during your next turn has damage reduced to it by 30. Now, moving over into the EXs, we do see a very, very similar thing, in that we literally had 3 different Deoxys EX. And again, they still had that same form change ability that let you search your deck for a Deoxys EX and switch it with Deoxys EX. Same ability, but remember that Deoxys and Deoxys EX are different, so you can only swap around Deoxys with Deoxys or the EX with the EX. And then we've got 2 energy, 10 damage, plus 10 more for each energy attached to both Deoxys and the defending Pokemon. So you could pile energy on yourself and smash with this. The one that for 3 energy does 50 damage, and you may discard 2 energy attached to it to do 70. And the one that does 50 damage for 3 energy, but prevent all effects of attacks, including damage, done to Deoxys EX by your opponent's Pokemon EX during your opponent's next turn. Good if you want to protect against your opponent's EXs. It was a very Deoxys heavy set, as you might expect. Now, there was a pre-release promo. It was Manectric, and there was one secret rare in the set. It was Rocket's Raikou EX, which was a very cool card, and it was nice to have a secret rare EX in there as well. Now, there were also a couple notable promos. One thing that I find very interesting, there was one of these Deoxys that was used as a stamped movie promo, and a regionals promo, and a stadium challenge promo. And shout out to the lovely folks at Bulbapedia for helping me out with that lovely little bit of info. It's kind of cool to see the same Pokemon used as 3 different promos. That's kind of cool. It also made its way into the theme decks as a holo exclusive. Hey, maybe we should talk about the theme deck, should we? Now, it might be a Deoxys set, but we still only get 1 theme deck with Deoxys and 1 with Rayquaza, which it kind of makes sense in the whole Gen 3 thing. Now, the Deoxys one was Star Charge, and yes, it did have a Deoxys coin in it. It was a Psychic Grass deck, and you got yourselves a Holo Deoxys. This was the normal form, and the Holo was exclusive to this deck. And then you got non-Holo versions of both Shiftry and Shedinja, and the non-Holo Shedinja was exclusive to the deck. It was only a Holo in the set normally. Moving over to Jetstream, this was the Rayquaza deck, and yes, you got a Rayquaza coin. A Fire, Water, Lightning deck with a Holo Rayquaza, which was exclusive to the deck. It was a non-Holo in the set usually. A Ludicolo, which is good. We'll get to Ludicolo in a moment. And a Camerupt, which again was a non-Holo exclusive, because in the set normally, Camerupt was a Holo. How cool was that? Now, in terms of the most expensive cards in the set, it really was Rayquaza Star. Now, the stars as a whole were quite expensive, but Rayquaza Star was kind of over the top expensive. If you can find yourself a good condition copy of this card for $1,000, you're doing pretty well. As I record this, there's a good version on eBay that is at $750, and there's still a bit of time going. You do unfortunately need to, you need to really put some money aside if you're going to get this card. Outside of the stars, the set isn't too expensive. The Secret Rare Raikou can be picked up for like $50, but certainly the stars, especially Rayquaza, are extremely expensive. Now, speaking of the stars, there were 3 in the set. The aforementioned Rayquaza, a phenomenal card we will be talking about in a little bit. And there was a Latias Star. Baby Daisy is pleased. This is maybe the one Latias card that Baby Daisy will not be getting for fairly obvious reasons. This was a very playable card. 1 energy, 10 damage, heal 1 from each of your Pokemon. 3 energy, 50 damage, but if the defending Pokemon is an EX, you discard all those free energy and do 150. 150 at the time was ridiculous. And then it was Latias Star, who was very, very similar. It removed 1 damage counter in all special conditions from Latios, and it did the same huge damage, but against a stage 2, rather than a Pokemon EX. Now, in terms of the EXs, we've already talked about the Deoxys, but the other ones, we saw a Crobat EX, which was very, very nice. We saw ourselves a Hariyama EX, which has seen so little love I didn't even realise this existed until a few days ago. A Manectric EX, which was part of a World's winning deck, we'll get there in a moment. Rayquaza EX, which was very, very cool. Salamence EX, gotta love some Salamence. And Sharpedo EX, which was part of a fun little rogue deck that saw a bit of love. Again, we'll get there in a moment. Now, if we start having a look at the best cards in the set, we really, really have to start off with Jirachi here. Because Jirachi's Pokemon Power Wishing Star says, once during your turn before you attack, if Jirachi is your active Pokemon, you may look at the top 5 cards of your deck and put one of them into your hand. And then Jirachi and your other active Pokemon, if any, are asleep. Yet remember how good Jirachi from Team Up is nowadays? This is better. It was gigantic. It pretty much immediately replaced Dunsparce as the very best starting Pokemon in the game, the one you really wanted to have when you started, well, just in the active, to get yourself set up. It was absolutely phenomenal, and it saw a redonkulous amount of play. Now, there were quite a few playable Pokemon in this set, including both the Ludicolo. Now, the best Ludicolo was the one with Swing Dance. Once during a turn, you may draw a card. That's pretty good. And then free energy, 10 damage, times the number of Pokemon in play, excluding Ludicolo. So if you've got 5 Pokemon on the bench, and your opponent has 6 Pokemon out, that's 110 damage, which is pretty good. You do have the option to discard as many cards as you like from your hand and remove that many damage counters from Ludicolo, which is kind of cool, but drawing card and big damage is good. Now, the other Ludicolo was not quite as good, though did see play in decks with the good Ludicolo, and to be fair, the good Ludicolo did see a lot of play. And once during your turn, you may remove one damage counter from each of your Pokemon, but the ability does not stack. It's once during your turn, regardless of how many Ludicolo you have. Free energy, 40 damage, flip a coin for each water energy attached to Ludicolo, 20 more for each heads. Could be good if you're feeling lucky. And then, of course, the partner for Ludicolo was Magcargo. And if that Magcargo looks familiar, it should. It was reprinted in Celestial Storm and still sees a huge amount of play. Incidentally, the Lucario was also reprinted and sees essentially no play whatsoever. Sorry, Ludicolo. And the ability was, well, it was exactly the same as it is nowadays. You search your deck for any one card and put it on top of your deck, but bearing in mind you've then got Ludicolo sitting there waiting to draw that card, that's kind of ridiculous. Now, Manectric EX was a very, very good card, mostly because of Disconnect. 2 energy, 40 damage, your opponent cannot play any trainer cards other than supporters from his or her hand during your opponent's next turn. Now, this would become really good when Mew EX came out, so that you could also copy Manectric with Mew, but this could do really fun things like you put Battle Frontier down, and then you would turn off abilities of stuff like Pidgeot, except because you were then blocking trainer cards, your opponents couldn't replace the stadium, they weren't allowed, and you could have it stick there for the entire game. Doing 80 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon was kind of cool, but really it was very much there for Disconnect. Now, Rayquaza EX was very, very cool. I told you we'd speak about the Star, and we will. But we also do need to talk about the EX here. Now, Rayquaza EX, once during your turn, when you put Rayquaza from your hand onto your bench, you may move any number of basic energy cards from your Pokemon to Rayquaza. And we've seen this ability many times over the years, but it gets it set up more quickly. And then you do 20 damage for each basic energy card attached to Rayquaza. If you can get the energy down, it was an absolute beast. And then, of course, we would play this with Electrode EX, which let you accelerate a lot of energy very, very quickly. And yeah, you had to give up a couple prizes to do it, but it didn't really matter because you would then take those prizes back using Rayquaza. And it was a very powerful Pokemon. Now, Solrock and Lunatone made a very good pair in this deck. It is worth mentioning that there was another pair of Solrock and Lunatone in a later set that was played with these dudes. Though these were the main ones, the others were very much... they were support Solrock and Lunatone. It was 3 of these and 1 of each of the others. So this Lunatone had a Pokebody that said the retreat cost for each Solrock you have in play is 0. It had an attack that let you look at the top 5 cards of either player's deck and put them on top of that player's deck in any order. Fine for a little bit of slowing down your opponent. But then for 2 energy, you did 20 damage plus 10 more for each Solrock you have in play. So you're hopefully looking 60 damage here for really not much energy on a basic Pokemon. You then had Solrock that gave each of your Lunatone 80 HP, making them a bit bulkier, bearing in mind they're still basics, and an attack that flipped a coin, heads paralysis, tails burn. Or for 1 psychic energy, choose one of your opponent's bench Pokemon and do 10 damage to that Pokemon for each Lunatone that you have in play. Single energy hitting 40 to the bench, really very, very good at the time. And these two did combine to do extremely well for a very, very long time. Now, Latias Prism Star was a very good Pokemon. It didn't really make a deck in and of itself, but it was a really, really good Pokemon to play in, for instance, Blastoise decks, as a nice little example. It was a great little tech, and when it could fit into decks, being able to do 150 damage to a Pokemon EX was absolutely huge. I also haven't said it in this video, so let me make it clear. The Pokemon Stars were limited to 1 per deck, and I mean 1 of any kind of Pokemon Star. Also worth noting, they all have their shiny coloration, even though for colourblind people like myself, that is not always entirely obvious. It is for Latias, though, and that makes me happy. Now, speaking of stars, Rayquaza Star was also a very, very good Pokemon. 2 energy, flip a coin till you get tails, 30 for each heads was a bit, risky for my liking. But 2 fire, 2 lightning energy, discard all energy attached to Rayquaza, and it does 100 to each of your opponent's Pokemon EX. Yes, it could take a little bit of setup. Yes, you needed a bunch of energy acceleration. But bearing in mind, I showed you all the Pokemon EX earlier. In this particular set, there are a bunch of Pokemon EX that would go down to this. Not all of them, admittedly, but a lot of Pokemon EX would go down to this. It was very much worth the investment. Although, like I've said, if you want to buy this card nowadays, you are gonna have to pay for it. Now, Plusle was another nice little card that did see a fair amount of play. For 1 colourless energy, you could search your deck for up to 2 basic Pokemon and put them on your bench. Nice setting up. But then for 1 lightning energy, you did 20 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon with any Poke Powers. And as we've been seeing looking at the top decks in a couple weeks, and you'll see this week as well, there are a lot of Poke Powers running around in the format at the moment, or back then. This could do an awful lot of damage very, very quickly. This could really, really build up. Now, there was a Minun as well, which was nice but not as good. But it did again see play. 1 colourless energy, put any 1 card from your discard pile into your hand. This was really good if you could recover POW hand extension with it. That was a card we looked at last week that let you either move energy from one of your opponent's Pokemon to another, or switch one of your opponent's bench with the defending. Very annoying card in that regard. And then for 1 lightning energy, you did 20 damage to each of your opponent's Pokemon with any Pokebodies. The pair of these could really spread some damage around, and it really was kind of awesome. Now, Weezing was a nice little tech in a bunch of decks. It really was played for the attack liability that put damage counters on the defending Pokemon until it was 10 HP away from being knocked out. Now, Weezing then did basically knock itself out, which is a little bit sad, but what you would basically do here is either you would have something that poisoned your opponent, or you would have that Victory Bell we spoke about recently that drops 1 damage counter on your opponent's active if it's in the active between turns, and then all of a sudden you would basically KO everything. Because Weezing would put them down to 10 HP remaining, Weezing would KO itself, you would then put Victory Bell active, and oh look, between turns you would then drop a damage counter, and whatever is in the active would be KO'd. Weezing wasn't necessarily a deck, but Weezing found its way into a bunch of decks. It was perfect for that situation where there is that one Pokemon that you just cannot get out of the active. Now, Grumpig was a very nice card. I've told you about this 4 corners deck that people played back then. And basically the deck was, I'm going to play a bunch of basics and stage 1s to hit a variety of weaknesses. So Grumpig here, the Pokebody said it couldn't be confused. Fine, I suppose. 2 energy, 20 damage plus sleep is fine. But 3 energy, 80 damage on an EX. Bearing in mind you're hitting weakness on any psychic types. And Grumpig basically in this 4 corner style deck was your choice for hitting psychic weakness. Similarly, in the same set we had Breloom, which was your fighting choice. 20 damage plus poison for essentially 1 grass energy was fine. But fighting double colourless 70 damage was cool. Next turn it was 50. But if you needed to hit fighting weakness, and bearing in mind, I've been showing you many cards this week and the previous weeks that were around in the format at the time you build in weakness and hit 140, that will basically KO anything you need to. This was very, very cool. Now, Deoxys did actually see a little bit of play here. There were a couple of EXs, 2 of them saw play, 1 of them didn't so much. But essentially, they hit Psychic Weakness, and Medicham, which we will see in the next set, was very, very good back then. So this was a really nice option just to be able to attack Medicham and take him out. It was quite nice. And then Sharpedo EX, now the lovely folks over at PTCG Archive did have Sharpedo. All the research I've done, talking to people, searching around, etc. Sharpedo was not a particularly phenomenal deck, although it did seem to be played by itself when it was played, but I want to mention it just because it's kind of cool. 2 energy, 20 damage, but before you do damage, you may switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active. although your opponent chooses a defending Pokemon to switch, i.e., if they've got more than one active, if you're playing 2-on-2, they choose which one switches out, but you still get to choose which one comes up from the bench. And in tournaments, it was still 1-on-1 back then. And this was fun. It basically meant you could always have a Pokemon they didn't want in the active and start chipping away. Now, free energy, 60 damage. You may discard an energy and do 80 damage, and discard one energy attached to the defending Pokemon. Was quite an efficient attack with a little bit of energy denial built in. Not the best deck around, but still very, very cool. Now moving over into trainers from the set that were pretty gosh darn notable. Strength Charm was a very, very nice one that saw quite a lot of play around. It basically was just a Pokemon tool that let you do an extra 10 damage. Now, it only lasted for one turn. It got discarded when you actually attacked with it. But that's not really the point here. It was played in Ludicolo decks, for instance. It was played in that Evolutions deck that did very well at Worlds. It's just the kind of card that comes around and lets you do extra damage, and that is a very, very good thing. Extra damage, as a general rule, is always good. Space Center was a fun little card that ignored all Pokebodies for basic Pokemon, other than Pokemon EXs and Pokemon with owners in their name. So it was quite narrow. Didn't work against evolved Pokemon, or EXs, or owners Pokemon. But if there were basic non-EX Pokemon you really wanted to get rid of Pokebodies on, Space Center absolutely had your back, and it did see a fair bunch of play. Now, there were also a couple of energy cards that saw a fair bunch of play. Heal Energy was a very, very nice one. It's made its way into a bunch of really good Worlds decks. Queendom played it, the Ludicolo deck played it, Dr. Ranatar played it. It was, it made its way around, shall we say. Now, what it did, it was a colorless energy, but when you attached it from your hand to one of your Pokemon, you removed one damage counter and all special conditions. Although it didn't work on Pokemon EX, it was just a colorless energy. But in a non-EX deck, and there were a bunch of them around as I've shown you, it was a tiny bit of healing while getting rid of special conditions. It screwed up the numbers for your opponent trying to get KOs. It essentially gave you a really good out to special conditions. It was a very, very good card indeed. As was Scramble Energy. Now, Scramble Energy was basically free of any energy. There's got to be a downside. Yes. It only worked on an evolved non-EX while you have more prize cards than your opponent. Now, if you had the same or fewer, it was just a colorless energy. And if it was ever attached to a basic Pokemon or EX, you had to discard it. But if we look at Pokemon like Dark Tyranitar, or Pokemon like Ludicolo, you have evolved non-EX Pokemon that can really, really use free energy. I mean, this turns Ludicolo into a single energy attacker, for goodness sake. That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. But in kind of a very fun way. It was what Pokemon were doing back then. They were trying to really push non-EX decks because many of the EXs were very, very good. But this just made Scramble Energy a very, very nice card. And it was very, very, very narrow, like I've said. It didn't work on EXs, didn't work on basic Pokemon, did not work when you had the same number or fewer prize cards remaining than your opponent. But when you met the requirements, it was phenomenal. And I suppose we should also mention Boost Energy while we're here. It only worked on an evolved Pokemon, and it had to be discarded at the end of the turn on which it was attached, but it's free colorless energy. It also weirdly stops you retreating. It's just so you couldn't use Boost Energy to retreat and just to retreat. It was cool. It was a very nice one. Now, looking at the top decks, really, there were 3 decks, I think, that came around primarily because of this set. One of them I've kind of danced around a bit already. It was what we called Lucario. Now, it did actually get printed as a Worlds deck. It was played by Michael Gonzalez, who was a semi-finalist in Juniors. But essentially, you've got Lucario to put any card on top of your deck. You've got Ludicolo to then draw that card, giving you huge consistency. And then you've got your main attack on Ludicolo that just does a lot of damage for very little energy. As well as Scramble Energy, we would also use double Rainbow Energy, and that would give you a lot of options for actually paying this attack cost really rather easily. Also would play the Rhydon we mentioned recently from EX Hidden Legends. That was the one that just protected your bench from damage, or did 70 for free energy, but bearing in mind we had a bunch of options for lowering that down, and it was just a very, very cool deck. The other really good one that came around because of this was Lunarock, although Lunarock wasn't quite ready. Now, funnily enough, it was printed again as a Worlds deck called Suns and Moons, years before Pokemon Sun and Moon would come around. And like I say, it did also play the Solrock and Lunatone from Legend Maker, but it really was primarily around the Solrock and Lunatone we've looked at in this video already. Both can do pretty good damage for pretty low energy, both give each other advantages. And it did actually play a couple different stadiums to drop damage counters. Desert Ruins, at any time between turns, each player puts one damage counter on his or her Pokemon EX with a maximum HP of at least 100. And Cursed Stone, at any time between turns, each player puts one damage counter on his or her Pokemon that has a Poke Power. Neither of those things apply to you here, ladies and gentlemen, so that means that you could really just kind of sit there and chill, quite frankly. Plus, you had a little bit of control built in there with Lunatone, and you could hit the bench with Solrock, and a very, very nice deck. The other one I do want to just shout out very quickly was a Rayquaza deck. Now, I did take this deck idea from the lovely Jason Klaczynski's retro blog, link in the description. And essentially, it really did revolve around that Rayquaza I mentioned earlier that just piled energy on and did a huge amount of damage. Now, I've already mentioned Electrode EX, because that had the Redonkulous ability whereby you discarded it, yes it knocked it out, yes it gave up prizes, and then you search your discard pile for 5 energy and attach them to any of your Pokemon in any way you like. Hang on a second, does that even work for Rayquaza? Yeah, because we're using Rayquaza Star here as well. And this could get Rayquaza Star rolling in one turn. In fact, it could basically get anyone rolling but Rayquaza EX or Zapdos EX. But then, of course, we remember the abilities. Rayquaza EX Poke Power, once during your turn, when you put it onto the bench, you may move any number of basic energy cards from your Pokemon to Rayquaza. And Zapdos, when you put Zapdos from your hand to your bench, you may switch one of your active Pokemon with Zapdos. And also move any number of basic lightning attached to your Pokemon to Zapdos. See where we're going here? You use Electrode to accelerate energy to anybody but those Pokemon, and then you can get rolling with those Pokemon. You would then combine that with Rocket's Admin to put your opponent down to a smaller hand size, and then POW Hand Extension to get rid of their energy, drag a different Pokemon in the active, etc. And the game could at some point be over right then. Bearing in mind, you give up prizes with Electrode, which makes Rocket's Admin a far, far better play, because of course you're giving your opponent prizes, but then you are immediately taking them away in a kind of hilarious way which isn't actually fun for your opponent in the least, but you don't really care because you're not trying to make your opponent have fun, you're trying to win the game, as mean as that might actually end up sounding. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen, that was EX Deoxys. Finished Generation 3, brought us Deoxys, quite a few Deoxys, and brought us some real metagame changing decks, as well as one of the very, very best cards we've ever seen. So that's everything I need to tell you about this set, but I'd like to know about your memories. Which cards did you play back then? Which were your favourite decks? What do you want to tell me about the decks? Go nuts, be nice. And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at The Wassy, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all that good stuff, head on over to patreon.com/PTCGRadio, where you can do exactly that. And please do make sure you're checking out youtube.com/WassyPlays, where you can find out about a whole bunch of games that don't have any Pokemon in, but are pretty gosh darned awesome nonetheless. But by far the most important thing as always, look after yourselves until next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.